booming economies, a massive rise in construction, and widespread innovation sounds about right for the 20s, does it not? Let's see what foods people enjoyed most during the hectic decade of 1920 to 1930. Waldorf salad had humble beginnings and was commonly found in the Waldorf Astoria cookbooks, and as you may have figured, gets its name from there as well. However, by the time of the 20s, this had become a go-to lunch for almost every state in America. Its popularity could not be overstated, and this was because the dish could be very versatile. You could serve it at tables for presidents or as a healthy family meal. It usually consisted of celery salad and mayo, with nuts and fruits like grapes. Besides the parties of the top elite, this was very common for neighborhood get-togethers, as well as every part of America had their own spin on the dish. The supermarket culture of America was actually a result of the growth spurt in America's finances during the Roaring '20s. A lot of marts popped up, and they became a much more common sight, and as a result, so did icebox cakes. These cakes were first shown to the public in World War I as a quick and easy way to whip up a cake, minus all the tedious baking. Everybody loves cracking open the oven every now and then, but sometimes you just want your sweet tooth catered to without all the grunt work. Icebox cakes were the way to go for situations like that. All you needed were crackers and some whipping cream. Many marts sold ready-to-serve packaged versions too, so you can imagine how this got around as much as it did. Baked Alaskas were some really tough competition for packaged products like icebox cakes, since the taste factor often gave people enough of an incentive to get up and start baking. This dessert consists of a cake with ice cream covered with meringue, baked for a while at the end to give the meringue a firm, golden exterior. The ice cream doesn't melt because the meringue helps protect it from the heat. Pretty genius dish, right? We love it when people use science in their cooking to make up nifty creations we could not imagine on our own. Now, why it is called the Baked Alaska is a bit of a hot debate. There is some weight to the idea that it was named like this when it first started being popularized in 1867 to celebrate the U.S. acquiring Alaska. While historians will always argue over this, one thing that is not up for discussion is how good dessert was. Trust us, Alaskans were not the only ones enjoying the sheer bliss of a good baked Alaska. Nobody could ever hate on a potato croquette, and a lot of people have paid their due respect to the game of these legendary appetizers, and that goes doubly true for the 1920s. Potato croquettes with a side of wings were an incredibly popular combo at many bars and diners, and they were also the go-to snack of many teenagers before or after school. Maybe you cannot imagine spending your Wednesday in either of those contexts. Okay, so let's say you have a party or want to throw one. One of the best munching options were potato croquettes because they made for great conversation food. That is a term we came up with to refer to food that really helps the flow of a conversation go by smoother. And there was nothing like talking the evening away with a good friend over a fresh batch of some croquettes. Similarly, tea sandwiches held their own rank in terms of what the best option for entertaining your guests is. Along with finger sandwiches and some croquettes or salad, you had yourself a pretty respectable follow-up to asking them to stay for a bite or two. Tea sandwiches were relatively easy and stress-free and also came in many different forms, like pineapple tea sandwiches or parsley bacon tea sandwiches and even shrimp tea sandwiches. All taste buds were very much catered to, so it is no surprise that they got so well known in the country. Plus, everyone loves to chat over some classy-looking food, and what better way to set the tone than with a high tea or brunch type of vibe? Introducing Duchess potatoes, which were potato hash browns, meets mashed potatoes meets potato cutlets in a way that redefined comfort food. Just as appetizing and mouth-watering as they look, these golden Duchess potatoes were purees of mashed potato made with egg yolk and butter. People would sprinkle all kinds of spices onto them, but you could also enjoy it if you kept the seasoning rather light. Sticking to just salt and pepper, for example, was not unheard of. You would ideally bake these until they get that golden sunshiny glow, and that is when you know they are done. This recipe really went wild in the South, where almost everybody had gotten in on the Duchess potato craze. After going through several decades of rough dieting that was pretty meatless and vegetable salads that just left you thinking some crackers were better for dinner, Americans very much enjoyed the return of proper eating with things like ginger ale salad. Salads had already been rising as their own separate area in America's cuisine, which might be hard to believe if you look at the fast food-ridden landscape of today, but 100 years is a lot of time for a nation to change. Ginger ale salad would make it into the Christmas and Thanksgiving traditions of many families. A pint of ginger ale, some pineapple, Canton ginger, and Malaga grapes, you were set for the rest of the night. This one dish could provide every tropical flavor note a person could crave, which is part of why it had so much success as a holiday meal. Peach melbas were a lot like that too, but they reminded people more of a breezy day during the fall, and it is hard to associate it with anything else. Maybe it is because of the peach flavor or the orange hue of the dish, but it really does invite you to take your time with it. Filled with raspberry sauce and peaches upon a hefty serving of vanilla ice cream, Auguste Escoffier first brought this magnificent bit of heaven to American tables in 1892, but it picked up a lot of steam during the Roaring Twenties. People could actually afford a lot of the ingredients to make this at home again, and they definitely could on a night out in the town. Mulligatawny soup became pretty popular in South Asian communities across the United States, and it was one of the first really well-known curry-based dishes that became sort of mainstream back then. The name is actually quite simple despite sounding complex. It just means pepper water. And we know you might already be thinking about the spice levels since it does involve curry. But do not worry. This was actually a bit more on the mild side and most people could handle it. But just in case you really doubt your tolerance, maybe keep some milk nearby for good measure. It would take about an hour and a half to make, but you could feed the entire family with just some onions and basic vegetables. Some chicken and curry powder mixed into one really homely soup. Chestnut puree was a much faster dish in comparison, only taking about 20 minutes to cook and 5 or 10 minutes to prepare. If even that seemed like too much effort, you could easily opt for store-bought versions in the 1920s. When dishes get real love in America, there are always handy variants of them at the store you can pick up for a convenient price. It would feed around 4 to 5 people, so maybe making it at home was not such a bad idea. People loved it for its nutty and earthy taste and how it used cooked chestnuts and vanilla beans to give a soft but very dense flavor. Combining the best of both sweet and savory, this was a middle ground for many Americans on opposite sides of food wars. In World War I, cow tongues became really popular because they were cheap and packed more than enough protein for your daily or weekly needs. Beef tongues were not exactly very familiar with Americans at that point in history, though, so to make them a little easier to go down the hatch, beef tongues with raisin sauce started seeing a lot of traction across states. They didn't require much either. Perhaps the hardest ingredient to find was half a cup of currant jelly. The rest of it, any home chef would probably find sitting in their pantry already. The meat would be drained, the bones cut, and then the skin was peeled. This would be served soaked in raisin sauce, and it was definitely an acquired taste. If you are wondering right now how cow tongues were popularized, do not forget that this was a time plagued with economic issues. People had to make do with what they had, and cow tongues fulfilled people's weekly protein intake like no other affordable meat in the market. And to be fair, cow tongues, when cooked well, were not all too bad. Egg custard pie is similarly just as easy to make since the whole thing relies on 5 simple ingredients, with the custard filling taking center stage this time. The trick to a fabulous egg custard pie is to make an incredibly smooth filling, almost like silk, and beating those eggs until they are the proper consistency helps. Nutmeg gives the filling thickness, while the crispy crust is the perfect packaging for this dessert to come in. This is why you would find it at nearly every family gathering, especially in the South and in states like Massachusetts and Georgia. Making the crust on your own was not a requirement since the dish already takes a while to make, around roughly 2 hours, and so using a store-bought crust is helpful. However, for the most authentic taste, you should go all in and make everything from scratch. A dish that can only be described as an edible fluffy cloud basking in the sunset, this baked meringue set in a puddle of crème anglaise, laced with caramel sets off all the alarms in anyone's heart, mind, and soul. A frothy egg dessert that won competitions and the favor of in-laws across America, this was one of the most iconic winter-themed desserts to go for. This was originally a French dessert, and appeared in famous cookbooks from the 19th century, like the Book of Household Management. As a result, you would often see it in French-American restaurants, and if you knew a home chef capable enough to take the dish on, you were a lucky person indeed. Mary Jane candy wasn't as flashy as a floating island, but it definitely took care of everyone's sweet tooth cravings in just the same way. A dearly beloved invention of Robert O. Lord, the man named it Mary Jane in memory of his favorite aunt. While Robert eventually sold his company and the recipe for this delicious candy was tweaked and altered over the decades, nobody can forget or surpass the excitement when it first came out in the USA in 1914. There is a reason companies like Stark Candy, Atkinson Candy, Spangler Candy, and Necco's kept vying for who would get to inherit the recipe next. This thing sold boatloads and made a pretty substantial heap of money to whichever company it would migrate to eventually. Needless to say, you shouldn't try to outdo the original, because although Mary Jane's sold well regardless of who held the rights, they never quite matched the quality they had when Robert O. Lord was making them. Hook-caught haddock fresh off the line from the most reliable fisheries in the nation, Finnan Hatties were the king of the smoked seafood scene, and despite being a hot choice in the 20s, this time-tested dish has survived and put up more than a fair fight in every era. Special occasions, comfort meals, or a fancy romantic dinner, Finnan Hatties were there to make any occasion significantly more exciting and a lot more flavorful. It was a pretty versatile dish, but it packed a lot of nutrition too, and it was always made from really thick fillets of fish, so you would be going with a full stomach when you were done eating. Also, Finnan Hatties were one of those dishes that worked as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so no matter what the time was, if you were having a seafood craving, you could whip this up and take care of that real quick. Pheasant Underglass sounds extremely fancy, almost like a dish with some deep philosophical meaning or historical context attached to it, but it is just a poultry dish with dramatic presentation. Not to say that does not add to the appeal, since presentation is a pretty big part of the overall experience. Pheasant Underglass was typically made with pheasant breasts that were braised in a wine reduction and served with shallots. This was also known as rich people's food in the early 18th and 19th century, and it was a sign of wealth. Eating dishes like this helped people feel more fancy about themselves, like they were more cultured, because they were having pheasant breast served in a glass dome. We cannot blame that thinking, because if our dinner came in a literal dome, we would feel more dignified about it too. Derby hot browns are not the only one of their kind, and the type of hot brown experience you eventually end up having depends a lot on what state you find yourself in. We even have Kentucky hot browns. Did you know that? Still though, one thing that is common to all of them is that they all take around 30 minutes to make and can feed a dozen people easily. God bless cooking in batches and easy prep. You might wonder where the hot brown originated, and while every state can claim its own take on the dish, only one can say they invented it: Louisville. Leftover turkey, an ambitious cheese sauce, and toasted bread would come together to create one heavy hitter of an open-faced sandwich. Definitely a favorite with kids, as you can imagine from the sound of it, but adults were known to get more than a little busy with it too. Shrub drinks were already really popular in America during the early 1920s, with one of the biggest hits being raspberry shrubs, and they were basically a good non-alcoholic drink to serve at bars or parties to minors, or just people who did not feel like getting their drink on. Aromatics, vinegar, concentrated fruits, and some sugar can work wonders in making you forget the joys of a whiskey on the rocks. Coincidentally, what was also very popular during the 20s were raspberries, specifically a strain of them known as Latham towards the end of the decade. Eventually, people literally put two and two together and came up with raspberry shrubs, and these almost overtook lemonades as America's most cherished drink. Open your minds and ears to one of the most confusing lineups of ingredients you will hear about: pineapple, lettuce, cherries, mayonnaise, yes, we were just as confused, and bananas. Now, what do all of these have to do with the other? Half of them sound like burger ingredients, and the other half look like toppings for a tropical drink or a fruit salad. Pineapple salad was exactly that though, and it would highlight pineapples by serving the rest of the ingredients on a ring of them with cottage cheese. Fusion food is one thing, but this seems like an odd culinary Frankenstein. Maybe experimentation leads to happy accidents, since pineapple salads were certainly a lot more tolerable than pineapple pizzas. At least all of the 20s thought so. Since this is the last one on the list, let's make it a bit more interesting with a quick tourist tip. If you ever find yourself wandering the streets of New Orleans, be sure to try sweetbreads. Not sure what those are? You would not see them in mainstream American markets, but in the 20s they used to be on the shelves everywhere. These were usually served with candied pecans, pumpkin, or even some smoked farro. For the more intermediate or advanced chef that had a flair for the dramatic linguine or mushrooms, and brown butter would also work great. Still, none of that was the soul behind a great sweetbread as much as it did add to the experience. The real fun came from a process called acidulation, where the sweetbread is soaked in lemon juice or vinegar for a whole day. You can even use buttermilk, and this gives it a mild flavor that packs an explosive blow after the fact. People thought this was a fun dish, and the store-bought sweetbreads were an easy and delicious dinner, so we can definitely see why they were so loved. That closes the curtains on the roaring 20s eating habits for this video. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive.